going to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about Fullbright and also the awards that we offer, which are primarily scholarships between Ireland and the US, and also to talk a little bit about the activities that we've been trying to do to kind of promote the work of Fullbright, and particularly arts and culture. My own background is in the arts and culture. I was formerly a curator at the National Museum of Ireland, and for the last 20 years while living and working in Ireland have worked in a variety of capacities within the arts, culture, heritage sectors and urban regeneration. So it's kind of my bee in my bonnet, and I brought it with me to Fullbright and have been busily buzzing away for the last 4 years trying to make the seemingly impossible possible in straitened economic times. Okay, so who are we? What have we on offer? And basically, maybe if there's time, if anybody has any immediate questions, and then if you want to follow up with us, I'll tell you where we are and who we are, and there are also promotional programs circulating with more detail about the range of awards that we offer. So basically, what is the Fullbright program? The Fullbright program was created in 1946, established in the US under legislation by Senator J. William Fullbright, and the primary purpose of the Fullbright program is to increase mutual respect and understanding between the people of the United States and people of other countries by means of educational and cultural exchanges. The Fullbright program now operates in about 155 countries throughout the world, and was established in Ireland in 1957. And we celebrated our 50th anniversary 2 years ago. Now, there hasn't been a huge amount of awareness of the Fullbright program in Ireland, and that's largely a historical quirk. When the program was established in Ireland, and discussions were going on between the Irish and US governments, in 1947, when the Republic was being founded, the Irish government's priority was not really in terms of education exchange, nor were they in an economic position to invest funding in it. Sounds all very vaguely familiar. And there was also a need to try and brand it in terms of the Irish state. So the compromise solution that was negotiated between De Valera and William Fullbright was that the Fullbright program would be known as the Onward Scholarship the Scholarship Exchange Board. So really for almost 45 years, recipients of Fullbright Awards did not know that they were Fullbright grantees. They thought they had received awards from the Scholarship Exchange Board. It was only when they got to the US that they realized that they were Fullbrighters. So then, growing on a number of years, and this largely came about as a result of Ronald Reagan's visit in the late 80s, negotiations went on again between the two governments about establishing the Fullbright program on the same footing as the way the Fullbright program is operated in most countries around the world, with a binational commission, which means that there is representation from both the Irish and the US governments on our board, and also to establish it on a firmer administrative footing. So in 1991, what I mentioned before, the Ireland-United States Fullbright Commission was established by legislation through the Oireachtas as a public body with charitable status. And we receive financial support on an ongoing basis from the US Department of State and the Department of Foreign Affairs and a lot of other leveraged funding. So just to give you a flavour of what we've been up to for the last number of years, the last couple of years, I took over as director in 2006. In 2007, as I mentioned, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. And one of the, I suppose, attempts through that program was to raise awareness of the Fullbright program and make people aware of the breadth of activity that we did. So we hosted and developed an exhibition of Fullbright artists' work at Farmley, which also travelled to the Highlands Gallery. And then there was a catalogue that resulted out of that. There was also a concert in Dublin Castle showcasing the musical accomplishments of a range of Fullbright musicians. 2 years ago, we had our record number of scholarships, which was 60, which was 30 in both directions. 30 Irish citizens going to the US, and then 30 coming to Ireland. You may have heard on the airwaves, we received some funding from the Broadcasting Commission of Ireland to produce an 8-part radio series to highlight the experience of Fullbright grantees, which did air a couple of times. We also commissioned and produced a DVD about the Fullbright experience, and I have some copies of that if people are interested, which was an attempt to try and document the evolution of the Fullbright program, but also the contribution it's made to professional and personal development and mutual understanding. Just last night, we launched, you're probably aware of it, some of you were there, a program of exhibitions highlighting the work of the Fullbright artists that are in Ireland this year at Mason Case & Curran, a law firm down on Bear Street. And if you haven't had an opportunity to visit it at the opening, it is open this afternoon, and there are a range of public viewings, and details I know are circulating somewhere. And we're leading up to now the 20th anniversary of the Fullbright Commission itself, so there will hopefully be a range of other activities. So what do we actually offer? First off, a new service that we've taken over since December is Education USA. It's an advice service for anyone that is interested in undergraduate and postgraduate study in the US. We provide unbiased, objective advice within our offices, and some of that is online, and then we also have an advisor based in our office. But the primary activities are the Fullbright Awards, the Fullbright grants, and I'm just going to talk about these very, very briefly. There's quite considerable detail with each of them, and they are spelled out in further detail both on our website and also in the brochure that is circulating. But primarily, Fullbright grants are a monetary award, they're a stipend. It also entails visa administration, particularly if you're looking to go to the US. We arrange a J1 visa for you on your behalf to enable you to stay in the US. You also are provided with accident and emergency insurance for the period of your stay within the US, and also a range of cultural and professional programs. And that works the reciprocal way. If US citizens are coming to Ireland, they also receive a monetary award. Students, we have negotiated a range of tuition waivers with universities in Ireland, so they get a package of that. They also get work permits if they're scholars, and a substantial amount of programming that we provide here. So, as I said, the way the awards work, they're broken down into two categories. There are awards for Irish citizens and also EU citizens resident in Ireland for 3 years or more. Ireland is quite unique in this, there are a number of other European Commission countries that aren't too happy with this, but the reality is that given we're all Europeans now, that if you are a European citizen resident in Ireland, you can apply to us, or you can apply back to your home country. We're the only commission in Ireland, in Europe, that actually does that. Because say if you are an Irish resident in Germany, an Irish citizen resident in Germany, you can't apply to Germany. You have to apply back to us. And I realise that we've had a number of applicants that are living in Ireland and for a number of years, and we would welcome those applications if they are here. So the awards are primarily for postgraduate research and study or lecturing in the US. For the student awards, the minimum period of stay is 6 months, and for the scholars, it's 3 months. Similarly, for US citizens coming here, we have a range of programs that enable students to undertake postgraduate research, postgraduate degrees. We also have a range of programs for scholars, such as the program Mary Bayard-White came through, that they're here in Ireland teaching and researching and collaborating, and we try and encourage as well as a range of professionals and artists to come. Last year, we actually had a graffiti artist, Steve Powers, who's based here in NCAD, and the evidence of his work is still down on Francis Street if you look in the car park of the Tivoli. And I'm also pleased to say that we have another program, which is known as the Senior Specialist Program, which is a short-term exchange, allows people to come in for a period of 2 to 6 weeks, and Arline Fisch, who's with us today, is a recipient of that program. So, the other area of endeavour that we have going on in terms of the advice, the awards, and we're branching out into trying to have more activities that promote and showcase the work of Fulbrighters and also the exchanges that are going on. So I'm just going to highlight the current one that is relevant to this. I suppose how this sort of really came about is Ireland, once again, has been unique, and it's consistently tried to give awards to people in the visual and performing arts since the 80s. And we had Guinness as a sponsor for one of our awards up until very, very recently. And when that sponsorship deal finished, I was obviously trying to keep on board a sponsor for the visual and performing arts. Mason Hayes & Curran are collectors of contemporary art. There had been an article in the Sunday Business Post about how they were encouraging students in their building to look at their collections. So I planted an idea, and I basically put a proposal to them. I'll be very honest, I was looking for money for scholarships in the first instance they weren't in a position to do that, but then we discussed about the possibility of them making their building available to an exhibition, and they were agreeable. And then, as it happened, by default or design, we actually had two US artists coming to us this year, Mary, as I mentioned, and then Erin Tracy, who was a painter based in the Burren. So I went back to them with a detailed proposal saying that it would be great if we could have a series of back-to-back exhibitions, talks, and ideally they would sponsor the hospitality and the catalogues, which they agreed to. So last night we opened the exhibition of the participants in the Landscape Aesthetics and Design course, and I think to resounding success to anyone who was there last night. That exhibition will run until the first week of May, and then Erin Tracy's exhibition will follow immediately after. So the whole purpose of it was to try, as spelled out here, to showcase the work and the creative conversations and collaborations that have come out of both Mary and Erin's time in Ireland, to raise awareness of what Mason Hayes and Kern are doing and what we're doing, to bring new audiences to Mason Hayes and Kern, and bring new audiences to Fullbright, to try and create more of a dialogue about contemporary art and craft making in Ireland. And I think, you know, recent discussions from Farmley and that are kind of going on, it's getting on the radar in terms of, not that it shouldn't have always been there, I would argue, but the contribution that culture can make to economic regeneration and social capital. So I would hope, and I think I kind of felt it happening last night, that that kind of event creates further connections between both Mason Hayes and Kern's kind of contacts, our contacts, and hope that there's a ripple effect in terms of additional activities. So really that's all I wanted to say. I know it's a lot for the first thing in the morning, but I don't know if there's any immediate questions people have about Fullbright and what we do that I can answer.
Just wondering, is there any age restriction in terms of people applying?
No, there isn't. There are, just to qualify that, some of the programs, there are age restrictions that are set down on the US side, but under the Equal Status Act in Ireland, they don't apply. So what will end up happening is if someone falls outside of the age band of a particular program, you may not go as a Fullbright recipient, but you will go as a recipient, and what we do is we make the package comparable to the Fullbright package. So that has happened before. So without further ado, I know there's a very busy day ahead, and I think Derek is going to introduce Arline.
Thank you very much. My name is Derek McGarry. I'm the lecturer, one of the lecturers in the metals area at the college. And thankfully today my task is really easy in introducing Arline Fisch to you. Most of you already know who she is. For those of you who are interested in an inspirational career, here are some highlights from Arline Fisch's career. She's an American artist and educator who works with metal. She was born in New York and she learned to sew and weave from her mother. And she's now developed into what I would consider to be a human encyclopedia for textile techniques using metals. She has written 2 books, Textile Techniques and Metals for Jewelers, and Textile Artists and Sculptors. But she has taught at Wheaton College, she was Skidmore College, and for nearly 30 years at San Diego State University, where she's now a professor emeritus. Arline's CV reads like a telephone directory. For every letter, there is a long list of entries, and it would be impossible to go through them and take up the entire lecture time. But here are a few highlights. In 2002, she received a Doctor of Humane Letters from Skidmore College. She's received 4 Fullbright scholarships, a gold medal from the American Crafts Council, an honorary membership of the Society of North American Goldsmiths, an organisation, a very important organisation which she helped found in the early 70s. She received a Distinguished Craft Educator Award from the James Renwick Alliance. And she received a Lifetime Achievement in Crafts Award from the National Museum of Women's Arts in Washington, D.C., an award for research, scholarship, and creative activity from California State University. And in 1985, she was declared a Living Treasure of California from the California State Assembly, so it's hard to beat that. She's also received awards from the National Endowment of the Craftsmen. Professional honours, she was a trustee of the American Crafts Council, president of the Society of North American Goldsmiths, and vice president of the World's Crafts Council. Now, her exhibition record and from showing internationally and from having her work purchased for all the major collections in the world is really impressive. I'm not going to go through it all, but let's just say she's everywhere she needs to be. It's a great honour for me to be invited to chair this presentation today. I know Arline well. I'd like to thank Caroline Madden and Mary White for giving me this honour. I'd also like to pay tribute to them for producing and directing what is an amazing conference. And I hope everybody takes the opportunity to thank them because it really is something very special for us. Some of you may know I graduated with an MFA from San Diego State University. So I had the privilege of working with both Arline Fisch and also Professor Helen Shirk. Arline is a very generous and talented educator. Her wisdom helped me transform my work, and I often think back to that as being my most successful period. So I have a lot of thanks and gratitude for that. It's an honour to have worked with her, to know her, and to have her friendship. And finally, there's one award that she was telling me about at the weekend that she's just recently got, which I thought was just great. From the Girl Guide Association of North America, she's just been given the 2010 Cool Woman Award. She is a cool woman, and she's going to present her work now.
Thank you very much, Derek. And yes, I am very pleased to be here as a Fullbright grantee. I feel a little bit like I've been very, not only lucky, but a bit selfish to have had multiple Fullbright Awards. But then I thought back, it's been over a period of about 60 years, so maybe this is like it's every other week. And I certainly highly recommend that you pay attention to that opportunity because it is a very viable one and quite worthwhile once you are involved in the system. Yesterday's presentation looked at craft in the present, but more importantly, how they might appear in the future. The new and developing opportunities in technology are positively dazzling, but also quite daunting for a person unused to such tools as myself. I actually retired from San Diego State 10 years ago, and so I'm sort of 10 years behind. My studio doesn't have all the technology that the university does. I don't consider myself a Luddite, but I find myself somewhat overwhelmed by the variety and complexities of technologies available to artists. My normal practice is a labor-intensive making of objects by hand, almost always my own hand. So when I need to use something like water jet cutting, which I have used, I tend to find somebody whom I can hire to do it for me. So I might do a drawing, I find someone else who will do the conversion from drawing to computer technology, and then it goes directly from that person to the water jet cutter, and eventually the stuff comes back to me. It's like magic. Learning a new language is not really how I want to spend my studio time at this stage in my life. But how exciting it could be to be at the start of a career in this age. I think you have such wonderful opportunities. Choosing a life in craft, even in the second half of the 20th century, was a decision that required courage, determination, a sense of adventure, and an entrepreneurial flexibility to find the best path, a highly individual path for each artist. And that much is still true. It's just the paths are somewhat different. I have been asked to comment on the catalog essay, The Critical Condition of Irish Craft, written by Ellen Clay. I'm not qualified to do that, but I have some thoughts about expanding an already rich craft heritage and encouraging young, emerging artists with community and financial support. The Fullbright is one of those opportunities. Just before I left the US, I received an article from the Renwick Alliance about the Irish Craft Council's exhibition called Material Poetry, which is going to appear at the American Irish Historical Society in New York City in October of this year. It will highlight the new wave of designer craft in Ireland, of design and craft makers in Ireland, whose work was selected for its poetic simplicity and material honesty. Many of the artists chosen for this exhibition by the curator, Brian Kennedy, have been shown at SOFA shows. SOFA, I'm not sure everybody even knows what that means or stands for. I had to look it up. Sculptural Objects and Fine Arts. Very odd title. Luckily, nobody calls it anything except SOFA. Shows in past years, but will now have an expanded audience in New York City, where the Irish American Historical Society is located. And some of the same artists will have participated in both places, so they will have had an expanded audience in New York City. And there will be a craft leaders caucus group from Renwick in Washington, D.C. coming to Ireland very soon, next month, I believe, to visit with some of the artists in their studios. This particular group of collectors is quite knowledgeable already about Irish craft makers, so can be expected to make probably rather substantial purchases, since many of them have well-developed craft collections. This is a good example of the expanding global community in crafts, which can be seen in the gallery and artist representations at high-end art fairs and craft markets. Looking over the list of galleries participating, for example, in the SOFA shows, which occur in New York, Chicago, and Santa Fe this year, it's fascinating to see how many of them come from other countries. I counted there are 14 different countries represented by galleries at these exhibitions or these markets. Australia, Japan, Korea, Israel, Hong Kong, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, and so on. These are mostly private galleries, which are in the business of selling art. But some are sponsored by national organizations, such as the National Craft Council of Ireland and Contemporary Applied Arts of the UK, sponsored in part by the British Craft Council. Collect in London, which I'm sure you've all heard of, is a newer sales venue with international gallery participation, although to a somewhat lesser degree at the moment, but I'm sure it will grow. With this in mind, how significant is it that there be a cultural identity displayed in the artists and works that are being selected? Why is this an important venue for galleries, especially considering the rather high costs involved? More important than national identity to the buying audience is the quality of the work on view and its marketability. Even those who are putting together collections, private collections, care about what things are worth, and they look at pricing as perhaps one of the criteria. These are above all selling opportunities in the growing international craft art market, with its numerous collectors and collector groups who frequent these shows along with the press and in advance of the general public. So the day before, the night before, there's always an opportunity for special collectors to come to SOFA or to come to collect and make their selections earlier. How important is it that there be a strong cultural identity manifest in the group of artists selected by a national gallery to be shown in an international marketplace? This is, after all, a different kind of venue from an international exposition at a World's Fair, where there is a greater emphasis on unique products from each country and a national pride on display. These thoughts bring me to the question of the importance of a cultural identity in the crafts at all. One has become so much more of a global community. There are certainly schools of craft production which are associated with specific places. I think of the Padua School of Jewelry, for example, which focuses on contemporary works in gold, or Dube design from the Netherlands. But these tend to have strong intellectual bases as well as recognizable visual vocabularies. My first exposure to a larger audience was in an exhibition called Young Americans, organized by the American Craft Council in the early 60s as a kind of survey of emerging artists. Everyone had to be 30 or less. I only got to be in it once. This continued as a program of the American Craft Council over a number of years. But in 1968 to 70, I'm not quite clear about when it all started, there was Objects USA, which was an opportunity for those invited to show several works selected, commissioned, and purchased by a pair of New York curators. The Johnson Wax Company sponsored this entire enterprise, and for, I believe it was a year in advance, Lee Nordness and Paul Smith, the curators, traveled the country and visited craft artists in their studios. They either selected a piece that was, or two, that were existing, or they commissioned a piece. Do something like this for us. And they were purchased, which was a great boon to many of us at the time. So with funding and commitment from the Johnson Wax Company, an excellent book accompanied the exhibition, which then toured to major venues in Europe, as well as several across the United States. I actually first saw the exhibition in Edinburgh, where I had the opportunity to model my own full-length silver neckpiece for the local press. This is the neckpiece, but that's not me. This necklace, along with other less conventional works, were seen by European audiences as typically American, always in the press, they were called that. At the time, I wondered what that meant. What about the work was American? And how important was it to me to be so designated? I must confess that I was much more interested in being noticed as an artist than as an American. And ironically, this neckpiece was inspired by my study of Mongolian nomadic ornament in the National Museum in Copenhagen, hardly an American experience. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the World Craft Council. In 1964, the American Craft Council spawned an international organization called the World Craft Council. It began with a large conference at Columbia University in New York City, with delegates from many nations around the world, and a program which included seminal work in metal, fiber, glass, and clay, funded in advance by Aileen Webb, founder of both ACC and WCC. I should say that the American Craft Council has never received any government support, financial support, except occasionally a grant through the National Endowment. But such grants are only project-oriented and do not support any organization. So these are primarily membership supported. The first small, to get back to this conference at Columbia University, there were several hundred people collected all in this one place. We all stayed at Columbia and had meals together for a week. And at the time, the first small-scale hot glass facility designed by and for artists made its debut in the courtyard at Columbia, as did experiments with electroforming in metal by an invited group of jewelry artists who spent a week together in Philadelphia prior to the conference, experimenting with the process. I knew from this experience at Columbia that I wanted to be a part of this international organization, which planned to host conferences every 2 years, and in fact did, in a different country. These conferences were attended by artists, writers, and craft organizers who were regular participants, so every 2 years you could expect to revisit at least some of the participants. However, I initially went off on just at my own expense as a mere participant to Peru in 1968, conferences were often held in really wonderful and exotic locations. So in Peru in 1968, but in 1970, when it was here in Dublin, I presented a paper on large-scale jewelry, and in fact, this piece was part of that presentation. So it's come back home to Dublin. And that Dublin conference was followed in 1972 in Istanbul, Toronto in 74, and in Mexico in 1976, where I was elected a director, in which capacity I served until 1984. The last international conference was convened in Australia in 1988. WCC still exists in some parts of the world, and has some specific programs in some regions, including Europe and Asia. But there is no longer any American participation, which I deeply regret. It is strange to me that in this era of globalization and international craft organization, no one flourishes despite UNESCO recognition and modest financial support. We campaigned long and hard to have UNESCO accept the World Craft Council as a recognized representative of crafts. It didn't produce as much financial support as we had hoped, but it does still provide some. The conferences brought together artists from village traditions, self-supporting artists working in craft media, museum and gallery people, even a few writers and historians, all interested in one way or another in the makers of craft objects. It was, for me personally, an exciting and enriching experience, and I still remain in contact with many of those whom I met in those years. I'm going to speak now more about individual work. There's an interesting book I would suggest, although you may already have found it, called Choosing Crafts. It just came out fairly recently. This is a very personal view of how various Americans have had a life in craft, from those who studied in university craft programs under the GI Bill in the late 40s, to those who themselves taught in those programs from the 50s until now, to those who make and sell objects at all levels of the marketplace. Because it quotes directly from the artists, it presents an amazing menu of options, of paths followed, and of thoughts along the way. A lot of the material is now housed in the archives of American art in Washington, D.C., because several years ago, a private philanthropist provided $500,000 to document 100 craft artists, because she felt that the archives of American art did not include craft artists as much as it should. And so 100 have been added to those archives in the past few years. So here are some of the artists who are quoted in Choosing Craft. Annie Albers, the Bauhaus weaver who emigrated to America, wrote in the magazine Design in the 40s that, in quote, "Craft has had a long rest. Industry overran them. We do not depend on crafts for our everyday needs, but we do still need the contact with materials," unquote. I thought that was an interesting thought from someone who was such an active participant in the Bauhaus movement. The jeweler Bruce Metcalf in the 90s talks about craft being a social movement, often intuitive and without leadership. He also cares about what craft is for and against. It is for beauty and the personalized object, for individualism and self-determination, and it is against ugliness, anonymity, and corporate labor. William Morris, the glass artist, uses images of ancient cultures to evoke stories that cross boundaries of space and time. He has recently retired at the age of 50. A highly successful artist, saying that he realizes his compulsion to create is independent of an audience or commerce, and the thought gives him a whole new freedom, as does, I'm sure, the money he has made in the past. His work sold very well. Paolo Antonelli, the design curator at MoMA, says that craftsmanship is no longer reactionary. Isn't that good news? Newly available materials on one end of the designer's vocabulary and interest in recycling found objects on the other. Both demand manual intervention and a craft-based approach by their very nature. Jack Leonard Larson, the textile designer, claims that craftsmen have great freedom. They are free from utilitarian constraints, free from dogma and symbolism, free from the dictates of tradition and culture, which touches somewhat on the theme of the symposium, and free to choose materials from a global market. But that these freedoms are treacherous and can lead to directionless irresponsibility. There's much to ponder in the informal, unwritten words of artists. I encourage you to read what some of them have to say. A brief word about craft education. Placing craft studies in universities is one of the distinctive characteristics of the American craft movement, as Bob Milnes illustrated so thoroughly yesterday. It proved to be a most fruitful decision. The academic community offers a broader vision than isolated design education and technical skill programs. Students are able, even required, to pursue intellectual studies at the same time greatly enhancing their critical thinking and writing skills. They are encouraged to try other disciplines along with studies in art history and art criticism. At San Diego State, for example, a popular course for art majors was physics for poets, a science course offered by a physics professor married to a painter. He was himself intrigued by the relationship between art and science. Another important aspect of career development is to explore as many avenues of support as possible so you can maintain yourself until you are established. Someone, a writer, once told me that I should expect to support my art until such time as it could support me. How do you do this? A little research is a good place to begin, especially if you are free to pursue adventurous opportunities. Artist residencies is an area that's full of possibilities, both at home and abroad, and a few hours on Google will turn up the most incredible and encouraging information about places offering studio and living space for varying lengths of time. I used to offer a course in career development for artists and talked about artist residencies for which there was a directory. It was always out of date. This now is always up to date, and it's amazing how many things are available. Some of them have full financial support, while others may require subsidy from another source. But it's interesting, if you're accepted as a resident someplace, it's not always so difficult to find somebody to give you the money to go there. The Kohler Company in Wisconsin is a good example of a corporate residency which has proven to be very fruitful for a very long time. It's been a program in operation for probably 20 years, maybe longer, where Kohler makes plumbing fixtures. So they have ceramic factories and an iron foundry because they cast bathtubs, and enamels because they enamel the bathtubs. And so they accept artists' proposals in any of those three areas of technical support, and they provide that support. You can go there, you learn, you work in the factory with production. You don't have to do any of that, but you can get help from those who are working. And it's an amazing experience, and you are offered all the materials you need, I think you're restricted to 3 toilets, if that's what you want to work with. But other than that, you may choose to do as you wish, and the work belongs to you. I think you leave one piece behind. Finding or even creating occasional teaching possibilities locally is another area of support that sometimes we forget is available. And then using another well-paying skill, such as language or computer technology. People sometimes don't think about that as actually part of their career. I had a student once who was finishing in jewelry, and she said, I don't know how I'm going to support myself. And I said, Julie, you speak 5 languages. Think about that. Surely you can find some way to utilize that skill, which she did. You could work for another artist on salary. You could share studio costs with several others. There's so many unique possibilities to be investigated or invented. Here are I'm going to show you 2 examples of invention that I never would have thought about. But before I do that, this piece, which is being modeled by my sister, who was a fashion model, was made in the mid-60s. And actually, it was made in Copenhagen because I had access to a workshop with the biggest chasing pole I had ever seen. I could hardly pick it up. But I also had the opportunity to use it, and so I could make these rather large elements. And I liked doing it so much that several years later, when I returned to Copenhagen for another period of time, I made a second large-scale piece. So here is the invention. A potter in Colorado has outfitted a vintage Airstream trailer as an art stream from which he sells his work, because he got tired of setting up for weekend craft fairs. Now he drives his work from place to place, parks, opens the door, and is in business. And I thought, it's not something I want to do, but isn't that an interesting way to go about one's career? A graduate student in jewelry at Virginia Commonwealth University moves his bench out into a public space on campus and invites people to watch him make silver rings, which he then gives away. He can afford to do this as a student experiment, but he's also building a public which could be there for him later if he opens his own business. I was fortunate, just as an aside, to support my art by teaching. I found a teaching position at the university level at a time when the crafts were expanding rapidly, both in numbers and opportunities. Unfortunately, that is no longer such a wonderful possibility, but it was great for me. What I also considered very important at the beginning was to enter as many exhibitions as possible, even though it was often expensive to do so. I rarely won any awards, but I was listed in catalogs, sometimes with a photograph, or I might be published in a newspaper story or a magazine review. And I entered international competitions, as many as I could find, even though I never saw the exhibitions. But again, there were catalogs, which an artist friend once told me were far more important than exhibitions, because the catalogs stayed around. Joining the craft community in an active way is another kind of support, not to be overlooked, at whatever level is possible, local, regional, national, media-oriented. These tend to be, at least in the United States, artist-driven and operated, with membership, meetings, conferences, publications, and committed volunteers who manage things as best they can until the organization is strong enough to employ a staff person to do the necessary administration. The Society of North American Goldsmiths, better known as SNAG, is one example. It began with a small group of jewelers and silversmiths, I think we were 18 or 20, who met in Boston in 1968 to discuss what was needed by the field for its growth and prosperity. Establishing a community within such a large geographic area was daunting, but exciting. We even debated for hours about the name because we wanted it to be inclusive. My name won. SNAG sounded better than all the other acronyms that we came up with. SNAG was officially launched in 1970 with a conference and national exhibition generously hosted by the St. Paul Museum of Art. So SNAG had no money, but it had contacts. People came, I think there were about 200 people who came to that initial conference, full of enthusiasm, and sat through hours of discussion, sometimes heated, to forge a membership organization to meet the mutual interests and concerns of those who were planning to join. The first few years were rocky, but we survived, thanks to some very dedicated members, some of whom offered office space, some of whom offered secretarial assistance. And now there is Metalsmith Magazine, which publishes 5 issues a year and has a full-time editor, a salaried executive director and an office, and an elected board from the membership, each of whom assumes 1 or 2 areas of responsibility for the period of 2 or 4 years on which they serve on the board. It also has an annual conference, complete with research papers, discussions, slide presentations, exhibitions, and of course a few social events as well. Other media are equally well served, and Sika in ceramics hosts an annual conference that now numbers, I'm not sure, the last I looked, over 4,000 people. And I remember somebody once saying, the only good thing about NSECA is that no pots are being made by all those people. Gas for the Glass Art Society began in 1971, Abana for blacksmiths in 1976, while the Handweavers Guild of America is probably the oldest and largest, with offshoots in surface design, basket making, and quilt making. Most of these larger ones, at any rate, exist at the local as well as the national level and provide numerous professional and social benefits for its members, including publications, exhibitions, and meetings, and workshops with artists invited from elsewhere. So that's as much as I'm going to talk about organizations. I have, over the years, found them incredibly useful to me as an individual artist. I would probably even more so than my university connection. And being without the university connection for the past 10 years, I rely even more on my connections through the network of organizations to which I belong. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how approaching your work in a new way can be exciting. Trying new materials is a way of nurturing creative insight, of moving work in a new direction, or simply giving oneself a creative challenge. Many artists are exploring the aesthetics of materials and using them as the language of expression. For example, Tara Donovan is a sculptor whose work you may have seen in publications, but we recently had an exhibition of her work in San Diego, and it was just a stunning exhibition. She works with mundane objects like plastic straws, styrofoam cups, and paper plates. These are styrofoam cups, and they are space-filling projects. What's even more amazing to me is that they travel from one place to another and are reconfigured to fit whatever space is available. And in San Diego, they actually got put into the spaces without her presence. She sent directions and assistance. So these are styrofoam cups and paper plates. Using in massive quantities to transform ordinary space into a kind of luminous poetry. Working with millions of straws, which indeed she did on the wall, just gluing them end to the wall so they stood out. Or thousands of cups could easily be termed obsessive. But she says, quote, "Obsessive is repetition that doesn't go anywhere, while my work goes toward an end, a specific point dictated by the architecture of the space," unquote. I thought that was a really interesting comment on, that is one of the impressions you have when you see this work. It's so beautiful when you look at it, and you're overwhelmed by the luminosity of it. And then you look at what it's made out of, and you think, oh my God, there must be a million cups on that floor. And some of us would think that that's more than we want to do. Many contemporary jewelers explore non-traditional and non-precious materials, either as an end in themselves, or as a kind of creative exploration. Working in paper, for example, is appealing because it can be so immediate, both as form exploration and as finished product. These are probably just form experiments to see what kinds of shapes might evolve. But in fact, Wendy Ramshaw and David Watkins produced paper jewelry for the market very early in their careers in the 60s. And didn't do anything with it for a long time, but more recently published a cut-out book of actual jewelry to wear made of paper. So this is a bracelet made of paper, comes flat in the book, you cut it out, and you put it together. Your own Angela O'Kelly works wonderfully rich pieces, neck pieces in particular, in paper. I'm not showing a slide of hers because I'm sure you are familiar with her work, which I think is stunning. Saw blades, commonly used by jewelers as a tool, here are used by Sergei Ivitin to make actual pieces of jewelry. It's hard to believe that these graceful pieces are constructed of sharp and dangerous steel blades. Also, jewelers' saw blades are quite short. They're maybe 6 inches. And yet here they are in a bunch, tied in a knot. It's not something I would ever even contemplate doing, but it's stunning, and it's really so thought-provoking to consider. Annika Smulovitz uses cloth collars from men's shirts, where the intent as well as the material contributes to the necklace. I thought that was she's done a whole range of neck pieces using just men's shirt collars. Joan Dulla has made crochet jewelry for years, but has lately incorporated shredded currency to produce furry surfaces on teapots and necklaces, with an implication, I think, of great value. If you suddenly recognize that these are really dollars cut up into small pieces, you think, wow, that must be a really important piece. Lucy Sarniel from the Netherlands uses zinc as a primary material for her jewelry, which is really most unusual. Zinc is not a metal that jewelers ever even consider using, and yet it's very beautiful. And she sometimes uses it by itself, as the beads you just saw, and sometimes in conjunction with antique textiles, which are mounted on rubber. Glass has been used for jewelry since ancient times, but some different applications have been investigated recently, as shown in an exhibition called Glassware of 2 or 3 years ago, organized jointly by the Museum of Art and Design in New York and the Schmuck Museum in Pforzheim. 2 of the more inventive examples are both necklaces. This one uses carefully blown bubbles, and this one uses rough-cut glass shards. I was once invited by the design director of Dube to come and talk about making glass jewelry. And I was very flattered to be asked, but in fact, I never could do anything because the liability issue was so large that the only thing I think they eventually made glass jewelry, they were always pendants, because anything else was too dangerous to contemplate what happens if it gets broken. And I think as an individual artist, we don't face that in quite the same way. But finally, I want to talk briefly about performance, which is a very popular art form these days, but it has great potential for craft media. This is not a new concept if one thinks about theatrical costumes or sculptors working with ballet companies. One of my favorites in this latter category is Oskar Schlemmer of the Bauhaus, who made dance costumes for the Triadic Ballet. And we once had an exhibition of these in a museum in San Diego, and I had not seen them before, but it was a real inspiration to think that one could consider really outrageous kinds of scale as long as you put it on the stage. Marjorie Schick, a jewelry artist who no longer works in metal, creates highly colored objects for the body using canvas, wood, and paint. Her things are always incredibly colorful and large, but you could imagine that they have a theatrical connotation. Jessie Mathis, who was one of my students a number of years ago, devises spiky metal enclosures for the body as a way of establishing personal boundaries. She's modeling her own pieces, and I guess people asked her from time to time, why do you do these? And she said, well, she got tired of people always staring at her bosom. So she managed to figure out ways to keep people at bay. Nick Cade is a fiber artist and a dancer, and he's made a series of sound suits out of fiber, twigs, and feathers in which he performs. And he calls them sound suits because he says when you're wearing them, they actually make noise as you move, which he hears. So these are things which he wears and performs in. Mark Newport knits elongated figures, and they are larger than life size. They're not really meant to be worn, they're hung. But they look quite tribal. And I saw an exhibition of this once, and the gallery was filled with these figures hanging. And it reminded me a bit of the Chinese warriors of Xi'an in their positioning and their kind of distance, a personal distance in their attitudes. Well, this is the work of Rika Lorenz, who makes buoyant balloon-like costumes for the stage. So rather like Schlemmer, they are performance pieces. Liz Collins is a fiber artist who works with knitting machines. And she not only knits her own sculptural costumes, of which this is one, but she also has an ongoing project called Knitting Nation, in which a troupe of machine knitters establish a camp somewhere in the middle of the city with tents and so on. And they work with hand-operated knitting machines, which in the course of a few hours produces a large collaborative work. So they're all wearing knitted things at the same time that they are producing knitted things, and they all are identified by their own symbol. So my latest adventure is in the arena of site-specific installations. I was invited to consider making a large work for the windows of the Racine Art Museum in Wisconsin. The largest things that I ever made, the necklaces that I showed you, those are large jewelry, but they're not large in any other sense of space. I don't really like working on a large scale because I like working with making everything myself. So when they asked me, I had to consider my self-imposed restrictions of scale, material, and process. I thought about it for a while and then said, well, if you like this proposal, I'd be happy to do the commission. And so what I proposed was a series of jellyfish, because they have an interesting form, they are colorful, and they move gracefully in suspension. And I had already begun to study their form and movement just because I thought they were so beautiful. Racine's goal was to have something colorful, so that they were in color was important. The space, this is the largest one, it's called a sea nettle. And it happened that as I was working on this project, a photograph of one of these creatures appeared in my local newspaper. It had washed up on the beach. It's 20 feet long, the real creature. And the following day, a photographer had gone out and found another one in the water and photographed it. And it was these colors. It was absolutely stunning. I thought, well, I can make those. So this one is made. The ball part is knitted on a spool. You know how you used to do knitted tubes? Well, that's how this is made, except with multiple wires, so it's fairly large. It's about 24 inches in diameter. And the tentacles are machine knit strips, which are, of course, very flexible and are just suspended in whatever space is available. The windows of this project there were 6 windows on a street. Each window is about 4 meters wide, 3.5 meters high, but only 1 meter deep. And the back wall was frosted glass, which couldn't be covered with anything. So it was a challenge to figure out what kinds of things you could put in that sort of space. But as I was working on these jellies, a friend gave me a wonderful book called The Deep, which had just recently been published. And it's a series of beautiful photographs of undersea life from the deep oceans of the Pacific. And I had already made some of these, and I leafed through the book, and oh, that's the one I made. Look at that. So they have rather repetitive kinds of forms. And these are all produced by knitting on a spool. So the pieces are very lightweight. The wire is not heavy. It's brilliantly colored in a permanent dye. And it's very easy to work with. It's just slow. So it took me a year to make this project. These are probably the most complex. They're about 8 feet long. And they're made with a machine knit fabric that I generate on a little sock knitting machine. I, many years ago, bought a tubular knitting machine for making socks. and I can knit tubes of 2 dimensions. All of the needles make a tube that's about 5 inches in diameter, and if I take half the needles out, I can make a smaller tube. And so I use both of those. Here, the green elements are just cut from a long tube and shaped and then sewn to the center tube. But in fact, they look very much like something called an orthocana. This is a lion's mane jellyfish. This version is about 7 feet long, mostly because of the tentacles. And again, it's machine knit. And then the little sparkly things that you see are crocheted silver wire, which picks up the light in a totally different way. And interestingly, I had made a necklace several years before that looked like this. And that was what initially sort of started me on the idea of jelly. So this is how it looked in the installation. The biggest hurdle for me was, what do we do with this wall in the back, and how do I make it look like water? And in the end, it was very simple. We put lights on the bottom and put blue gel over it, and it just made it look like an aquarium. Now, the whole project has closed at Wisconsin. It was up for 12 months, and my contract with them stipulated that I own it, so it all had to be packed. And the thought of having it come back to my studio was more than I wanted to contemplate. So I suggested that maybe it could go someplace else, and it is now at a museum in San Diego, where it's in a big atrium. It's about this size, this dimension, with ceilings a little bit higher than this. So the pieces now aren't segregated by type and color. They're all mixed together. And we had a lighting designer come, and he placed lights in such a way that they are multiplied by their shadows on both the walls and the floor. So that's been a very exciting finale to that for me. But halfway through the installation at Racine, I was supposed to make some kind of change. I could either add something or subtract something or change something. I chose to add. And what I added were a series of corals which sat in the windows down below. And they stem from my looking at corals. I went to our local aquarium, photographed lots of corals, but it also was inspired by the Coral Reef Project, which is now here in Dublin at the Science Gallery. And it's a kind of assemblage project that keeps growing, and it's all crocheted. These pieces are knitted tubes with crocheted edges. Thank you very much.